Sometimes life hands you burdens that feel too heavy to carry. When 6-year-old Mary Elizabeth inherited her grandfather's broken-down church, everyone in Millbrook felt sorry for the little girl. The old building was falling apart. Paint was peeling off the walls. Windows were cracked and dirty. People walked by and shook their heads. What was a child supposed to do with such a mess? Ruth Morrison was 62 and recently widowed. She became Mary's guardian and felt overwhelmed by the responsibility. The church looked hopeless. Her own faith felt shaky after losing her husband. But Ruth and Mary decided to fix the old place up anyway. While working on the roof, they found something hidden that no one expected. It was a discovery worth over $200 million. But would this fortune bring the town together or tear it apart? Before we dive in, tell us where you're listening from. And if this story moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow's tale will touch your heart even deeper. Ruth Morrison had never imagined that at 62, she would be standing in a lawyer's office holding the small, warm hand of a 6-year-old girl who had just become her responsibility. The mahogany-paneled room smelled of old books and fresh coffee, but all Ruth could focus on was the weight of Pastor William's personal Bible in her free hand, a warm leather volume that had been pressed into her palm moments before. The lawyer, a kind man named Thomas Bradley, who had known Pastor William for 30 years, adjusted his glasses and spoke in the gentle tone reserved for delivering life-changing news. Mrs. Morrison, as specified in Pastor William's will, you are now Mary Elizabeth's legal guardian. The church property, all 23 acres, transfers to the child upon his death, with you serving as trustee until she reaches 18. Mary. Elizabeth squeezed Ruth's hand tighter. Her blonde curls caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, and her blue eyes, so much like her grandfather's, remained remarkably calm for a child who had just lost the most important person in her world. What about her parents? Ruth asked, though she already knew the painful answer. As you know, David and Sarah were killed in that car accident when Mary was barely 2. Pastor William has been her sole guardian since then. There are no other living relatives who can take her. Thomas Bradley's voice carried the weight of a man who had delivered too much heartbreaking news over the years. Ruth opened the Bible to a random page and found pressed between the thin pages a small wildflower, forget-me-not, still retaining traces of its original blue color. Pastor William's handwritten notes filled the margins in his careful script. Observations about faith, hope, and the importance of believing in things unseen. One note, written in fresher ink, caught her attention. Sometimes God places treasures in the most unexpected places and the most unexpected hearts. The drive back to Millbrook took 45 minutes through rolling countryside that had once thrived with small farms, but now showed signs of economic decline. Empty barns dotted the landscape like forgotten prayers, their weathered wood telling stories of better times. Ruth had made this journey countless times over the past 3 decades, but today it felt different, heavier with possibility and responsibility. Mary Elizabeth sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a small stuffed lamb that Pastor William had given her on her last birthday. She hadn't spoken much since the funeral 3 days ago, but Ruth could see the wheels turning behind those perceptive eyes. This child had already experienced more loss than many adults, yet she possessed a quiet strength that reminded Ruth of her grandfather. "Miss Ruth," Mary finally said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Grandpa William always said the church was special. He said it was waiting for the right time to show everyone what it really was." Ruth felt her throat tighten. Her own relationship with faith had become complicated since her husband Harold's death 6 months earlier. Cancer had taken him slowly, and despite years of devoted service to their own congregation across town, despite countless prayers and the support of their church family, Harold had slipped away on a cold February morning. Ruth had felt abandoned. by the God she had served faithfully for 40 years. What did he mean by that, sweetheart? Ruth asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. I don't know yet, Mary said with the honest uncertainty of childhood. But he said I would understand someday. He said the church was like a treasure chest that was waiting for the right key. Millbrook appeared ahead of them, a town of barely 800 souls that had seen better decades. Main Street stretched for 6 blocks, lined with buildings that spoke of more prosperous times. A hardware store, a diner, a small grocery, and several empty storefronts with for rent signs that had become permanent fixtures. The population had been steadily declining as young people left for opportunities in larger cities, leaving behind an aging community struggling to maintain its identity. Pastor William's church sat on the outskirts of town, separated from the nearest neighbor by a quarter-mile of overgrown fields. The building itself was a modest white wooden structure built in 1923, with a simple steeple that rose 50 feet into the sky. What had once been a well-maintained symbol of community faith now showed the neglect of the past 3 years since Pastor William's health had forced him to stop regular services. As Ruth turned into the gravel driveway, she could see the full extent of the building's deterioration. The white paint was indeed peeling, revealing weathered gray wood underneath. Several window panes were cracked, and the front steps sagged under the weight of neglect. The small cemetery behind the church was overgrown with weeds, though someone, probably Pastor William himself, had kept the graves reasonably clear of debris. It looks sad, Mary observed with the straightforward honesty that only children possess. Ruth parked the car and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. She had visited Pastor William here many times over the years, but always when he was alive to fill the space with his gentle presence and unwavering faith. Now the building seemed to echo with absence. They walked to the front door together, Mary's small hand still firmly clasped in Ruth's. The key that Thomas Bradley had given them turned easily in the old lock, and the door swung open with a prolonged creak that spoke of unused hinges. The interior was surprisingly well preserved, despite the external decay. Afternoon sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colored patterns across 12 rows of wooden pews. The altar was simple but dignified, with a hand-carved wooden cross that Pastor William had made himself 40 years earlier. Everything was covered with a fine layer of dust, but the basic structure remained sound. Mary walked slowly down the center aisle, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. She stopped at the front pew and turned to face the sanctuary, much as her grandfather had done thousands of times over his 4 decades of ministry here. He used to let me help him dust the pews, she said softly. He said every piece of wood had been touched by people who needed hope. Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes. This child's matter-of-fact acceptance of loss and responsibility was both heartbreaking and inspiring. At 6 years old, Mary Elizabeth already understood things about faith and human nature that many adults never grasped. Miss Ruth, are we really going to live here? Mary asked, turning to face her new guardian. The practical reality of their situation hit Ruth like a cold wind. Her own small house across town would be adequate for both of them, but the church property was now Mary's inheritance and responsibility. Someone would need to maintain it, make decisions about its future, and somehow find a way to preserve what Pastor William had spent his life building. We'll figure it out together, Ruth said, though she had no idea how they would manage. Her own savings were modest, and the cost of repairing the building would be substantial. The town had shown little interest in maintaining the church after Pastor William's retirement, and finding a new minister for such a small congregation seemed unlikely. As they explored the building, Ruth began to appreciate the craftsmanship that had gone into its construction. The wooden floors were solid oak, installed by hand nearly a century ago. The windows, despite their current condition, contained beautiful stained glass that depicted scenes of faith and hope. The altar area had been built with careful attention to acoustics, allowing even quiet words to carry to the back of the sanctuary. In the small office behind the altar, they found Pastor William's desk exactly as he had left it. His sermon notes from 3 years ago still lay in neat stacks, along with correspondence from community members and copies of inspirational readings he had collected over the decades. The desk drawers contained the accumulated treasures of a lifetime in ministry: photographs of baptisms and weddings, letters from grateful parishioners, and small mementos that had obviously held special meaning. Mary climbed into Pastor William's chair, her small frame dwarfed by the large wooden seat. She opened the center drawer and pulled out a small leather-bound journal that Ruth had never seen before. "Look, Miss Ruth," Mary said, holding up the journal. "Grandpa William's treasure map." Ruth took the journal and opened it to the first page. In Pastor William's careful handwriting were the words, "For Mary Elizabeth, when the time is right." The greatest treasures are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for eyes that can see beyond the surface. The following pages contained what appeared to be detailed observations about the church property measurements, notes about the building's construction, sketches of various architectural features, and references to historical documents and land surveys. Some entries were dated as recently as 6 months ago, suggesting that Pastor William had been working on this project right up until his final illness. One entry caught Ruth's particular attention: the original land grant documents from 1889 may hold more significance than anyone realized. The Mackenzie Trust papers were never properly filed with the county, and the implications could be substantial. Mary will need guidance to understand what this means, but I believe she has the wisdom to use whatever is discovered for the greater good. Ruth felt a chill of possibility run down her spine. Pastor William had been many things: minister, counselor, community leader, but he had also been a meticulous researcher with a deep interest in local history. If he had discovered something significant about the church property, something important enough to document so carefully, then maybe their inheritance was more valuable than anyone had realized. As the afternoon light began to fade, Ruth and Mary locked up the church and drove back to Ruth's house in town. The small 2-bedroom home would serve as their base while they figured out their next steps. But Ruth knew that their real future lay in the deteriorating building they had just explored. That night, after Mary had fallen asleep clutching her stuffed lamb, Ruth sat at her kitchen table with Pastor William's journal and his worn Bible. The pressed forget-me-not had fallen out onto the table, and she studied its faded beauty while reading through the careful notes about land grants and trust documents. Harold's voice seemed to whisper in her memory, "Ruth, sometimes the hardest journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations." She had thought those words were meant to comfort her about his illness, but maybe they had been preparation for this unexpected chapter of her life. Outside her window, the lights of Millbrook twinkled like earthbound stars, a small community full of people who had their own struggles and dreams. Tomorrow she would begin the practical work of understanding what Pastor William had left them. But tonight she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, they had inherited more than a crumbling building and an overwhelming responsibility. Maybe they had inherited a chance to discover something wonderful. Asterisk. The storm that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, announcing itself with thunder that rolled across the countryside like cannon fire. Ruth had been planning to spend the day organizing Pastor William's papers, but the weather had other plans for them. Mary Elizabeth pressed her face against the kitchen window, watching sheets of rain sweep across the yard. "The church will be getting wet inside," she said with the worry of someone who already understood the weight of ownership. Ruth felt her stomach clench. She had been dreading this moment, the first real test of their ability to maintain the old building. The roof had looked questionable during their initial inspection, and a storm of this magnitude would reveal every weakness in the decades-old structure. "We should go check on it," Ruth said, though the idea of driving through the storm made her nervous. Yes, Mary agreed with the firm determination that had surprised Ruth repeatedly over the past few weeks. Grandpa William would want us to take care of it. They drove through town slowly, windshield wipers struggling against the deluge. Main Street was nearly deserted, except for a few pickup trucks parked outside Murphy's Diner, where the local coffee crowd had taken shelter. Through the rain-streaked windows of her car, Ruth could see the concerned faces of townspeople who were probably discussing their own weather-related worries. The church parking lot was already collecting puddles when they arrived. Ruth parked as close to the front door as possible, and they ran through the rain together, Mary's small boots splashing through the rapidly forming streams of water. The moment Ruth unlocked the front door, she knew they were in trouble. The sound of dripping water echoed through the sanctuary like a leaky faucet multiplied by a dozen. They stepped inside to find water streaming through several places in the ceiling, creating small waterfalls that splashed onto the wooden floors and pews. "Oh no," Mary whispered, her voice echoing in the space. Ruth's first instinct was panic, but looking at Mary's upturned face, she realized that this moment would set the tone for how they handled every challenge ahead. She could either crumble under the weight of responsibility or show this brave little girl that problems could be solved with patience and determination. "Well," Ruth said, trying to keep her voice steady, "I guess we know what needs to be fixed." First, they spent the next hour positioning every pot, pan, and bucket they could find in Ruth's car to catch the leaks. The largest hole in the roof was directly above the altar, sending a steady stream of water onto the spot where Pastor William had delivered thousands of sermons. Ruth found herself blinking back tears as she watched the water pool on the floor, where so many people had knelt to pray over the years. Mary climbed onto one of the front pews to get a better look at the ceiling. "Miss Ruth, look at that funny board up there," she said, pointing toward a section of the roof where the water was running along what appeared to be an unusual seam in the wooden planking. Ruth looked up and saw what Mary was pointing at, the rectangular section of the ceiling that seemed to be constructed differently from the surrounding area. The wood was a slightly different color, and the joints didn't match the rest of the ceiling's pattern. "That's odd," Ruth murmured. In all her visits to the church over the years, she had never noticed that particular feature. The storm continued for 3 hours, and by the time it passed, they had identified 7 separate leaks of varying severity. The immediate crisis was contained, but Ruth knew they were looking at thousands of dollars in repair costs money she simply didn't have as they were preparing to leave. Mary tugged on Ruth's sleeve. "Can we go up to the attic? I want to see where the water is coming from." Ruth hesitated. The church had a small attic space accessible through a narrow stairway behind the altar, but she had never explored it. Pastor William had mentioned it occasionally, usually in the context of storing Christmas decorations or old church records. "I suppose we should assess the damage," Ruth agreed, though the idea of climbing into a potentially dangerous space during a storm made her nervous. The stairway was steeper than Ruth had expected, and the attic space was cramped and poorly lit. She used the flashlight app on her phone to navigate the low-ceilinged area, stepping carefully on the wooden joists to avoid putting her foot through the ceiling below. The storm damage was immediately visible several places where the roof decking had rotted through, allowing water to pour into the space below. But as Ruth moved her light around the cramped area, she noticed something that made her heart skip a beat. The rectangular section that Mary had spotted from below was actually a wooden panel that had been carefully fitted into the ceiling, but not permanently attached. The edges were sealed, but not nailed down, and the water damage had caused the sealant to loosen. "Mary, can you hand me that old screwdriver from the toolbox down there?" Ruth called down through the access opening with Mary's help providing additional light from below. Ruth was able to work the panel loose. It was heavier than she expected, and she had to be careful not to drop it through the ceiling. When she finally managed to lift it aside, her flashlight revealed a hidden compartment built into the space between the ceiling joists. Inside the compartment was a metal document box, the kind used to protect important papers from fire and moisture. It had been wrapped in oilcloth and seemed to have survived decades of hiding without significant damage. Ruth's hands were shaking as she lifted the box out of its hiding place. It was substantial, probably 8 inches by 12 inches and 3 inches deep and heavy enough to suggest it contained more than just papers. "What did you find, Miss Ruth?" Mary called from below, her voice tight with excitement. "I'm not sure yet," Ruth replied, though her heart was racing with possibilities. "Let's get down from here and take a look." Back in the sanctuary, they sat together on the front pew with the mysterious box between them. The metal was tarnished but not rusted, and there was no visible lock, just a simple latch that opened with a soft click. Inside, they found documents that would change their lives forever. The first item was a letter addressed to the future stewards of Millbrook Community Church, written in Pastor William's unmistakable handwriting but dated only 2 months before his death. Ruth read aloud, "If you are reading this, then the time has come for the truth to be revealed. What I discovered 3 years ago was too important to share while I was alive. Too many people would have been hurt, and too many wrong decisions would have been made. But Mary Elizabeth, with the right guidance, will know how to use this gift for the blessing of our community." Beneath the letter were documents that made Ruth's head spin: land surveys from 1889, legal papers establishing something called the Mackenzie Trust, and correspondence between Pastor William and various historical researchers and legal experts. But the document that made Ruth gasp out loud was a surveyor's report dated 6 months earlier. According to the official measurements and legal descriptions contained in the report, the church property was not the 23 acres they had assumed. Due to a mapping error that had persisted for over a century, their inheritance actually included nearly 800 acres of prime real estate that stretched all the way to the interstate highway land that was now in the path of a major commercial development project. The final document in the box was a letter from a development company dated just weeks before Pastor William's death, offering to purchase what they assumed was 23 acres for $200,000. A handwritten note in the margin, in Pastor William's script, read, "They have no idea what they're actually trying to buy." Mary looked up at Ruth with wide eyes. "Miss Ruth, does this mean we're rich?" Ruth stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process the implications. If the surveys were correct, if the legal papers were valid, then they weren't just inheriting a rundown church building. They were inheriting a fortune that could transform not just their lives, but the entire community of Millbrook. But as she looked at Mary's innocent face and thought about the storm damage still dripping around them, Ruth realized that this discovery came with a responsibility that was both thrilling and terrifying. Whatever decisions they made from this point forward would affect not just them, but everyone in the community who had watched them inherit what they thought was a burden. The rain had stopped, but Ruth felt like they were standing at the edge of a much larger storm, one that would test everything she thought she knew about faith, community, and the unexpected ways that life can change in a single afternoon. Ruth spent 3 sleepless nights studying the documents they had discovered, spread across her kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that was slowly revealing a picture she never could have imagined. Each legal paper, each survey map, each piece of correspondence built a case that seemed too extraordinary to be true. The Mackenzie Trust documents were the foundation of everything else. In 1889, a wealthy railroad investor named Jonathan Mackenzie had purchased nearly 1,000 acres of land around what would eventually become Millbrook. His intention had been to establish a model community, a place where working families could own their homes, worship freely, and raise their children with dignity and opportunity. Mackenzie's vision included setting aside specific parcels for community purposes, schools, churches, and public spaces that would remain forever in trust for the benefit of the residents. When he died unexpectedly in 1894, his executors had been tasked with implementing his detailed plans for the community, but something had gone wrong in the legal process. The trust documents had been filed incorrectly. Land boundaries had been mismeasured, and over the decades, the true extent of the community land trust had been forgotten. Most of the original 1,000 acres had been sold off piecemeal to private owners who had no knowledge of the original trust provisions. Pastor Williams' research had uncovered the truth. The church property was the key parcel in Mackenzie's original plan, and due to legal technicalities that had never been resolved, it still carried the rights to all the community land that Mackenzie had intended to preserve in perpetuity. Ruth's phone calls to Thomas Bradley, the lawyer who had handled Pastor Williams' estate, confirmed her worst fears and greatest hopes. The documents were legitimate, the surveys were accurate, and the legal implications were staggering. "Mrs. Morrison," Thomas had said during their third conversation, his voice heavy with the weight of professional responsibility, "if these papers stand up to legal challenge, and I believe they will then, Mary Elizabeth has inherited one of the largest private land holdings in the county. The development company that's been trying to build that shopping complex has been negotiating with people who don't actually own the land they're trying to sell." Ruth felt dizzy thinking about it. The interstate highway that passed within a mile of the church had brought increasing development pressure to the area. The shopping complex project alone was worth over $50 million. But according to the trust documents, any commercial development on the community land would require the approval of the trust's designated steward, which now appeared to be Mary Elizabeth, represented by Ruth as her guardian. But the legal complexities were only the beginning of Ruth's worries. Word was already spraying through Millbrook that something unusual was happening with the old church property. Ruth had noticed the curious looks when she and Mary went to the grocery store, and she had overheard whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. The situation became more complicated when Mary began asking questions that Ruth wasn't prepared to answer. "Miss Ruth," Mary said over breakfast on Friday morning, "why are people looking at us funny? Mrs. Patterson at the post office got all quiet when I walked in yesterday." Ruth set down her coffee cup and studied the earnest face of the little girl who had unknowingly become one of the wealthiest landowners in the region. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that money changes everything, even when people don't know exactly how much money is involved? Sometimes when things change, people need time to understand what it means, Ruth said carefully. "We're still learning about Grandpa William's gift to you, and I think other people are curious about what we might discover." Mary nodded solemnly, but Ruth could see the wheels turning behind those perceptive blue eyes. This child had already learned that life could change without warning, and she was developing an intuitive understanding of adult emotions that was both impressive and heartbreaking. Their morning was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Ruth opened it to find Sam Fletcher, a man in his 50s who owned Fletcher Construction and had known Pastor William for decades. Sam's weather-beaten face wore the expression of someone bearing uncomfortable news. "Ruth, I hope you don't mind me stopping by," Sam said, removing his baseball cap. "I heard you and little Mary had some storm damage out at the church, and I wanted to offer my help with the repairs." Ruth invited him in, grateful for what seemed like a straightforward offer of community support. Sam accepted a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, his work-calloused hands wrapped around a warm mug. "The thing is," Sam continued after the initial pleasantries, "I've been getting some interesting phone calls this week. Seems like there are folks asking questions about the church property, who owns it, what the boundaries are, whether there might be development opportunities." Ruth felt her stomach tighten. What kind of folks? Well, That's the curious part. Some of them claim to represent land development companies, but they're not local. And they're asking very specific questions about historical land records and trust documents. Sam's eyes met Ruth's with the directness of someone who had spent his life dealing with practical problems. "Ruth, is there something I should know about what you and Mary inherited?" The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Ruth had hoped. She realized that trying to keep their discovery secret would be both impossible and potentially dangerous. If commercial interests were already sniffing around the property, then Ruth and Mary needed allies who understood the situation and could help them navigate the challenges ahead. She retrieved the document box from her bedroom and brought it to the kitchen table. Over the next hour, she walked Sam through everything they had discovered, watching his expressions change from curiosity to amazement to concern. "Sweet Lord," Sam whispered when Ruth finished explaining about the Mackenzie Trust and the true boundaries of the church property. "Ruth, do you understand what this means? That development company has been spending millions on preliminary work for a project they can't legally complete. And there are probably dozens of property owners who think they have clear title to land that's actually held in trust." Ruth nodded, feeling the full weight of their situation settling on her shoulders like a heavy coat. "Sam, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If word gets out about this before we have a proper legal strategy, what do you think will happen?" Sam was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "Ruth, I think you and Mary are about to find out who your real friends are," he said slowly. "Because when this much money is involved, people change. Some will want to help you, some will want to take advantage of you, and some will decide that a 6-year-old girl and a widow don't deserve this kind of blessing." Mary, who had been coloring quietly at the far end of the kitchen table, looked up at the adults with the unsettling perception that had become familiar to Ruth over the past few weeks. "Miss Ruth," Mary said in her clear, honest voice, "Grandpa William always said that when God gives you a gift, it's because he knows you'll use it to help other people. Maybe the money isn't supposed to be just for us." Sam stared at the little girl with something approaching wonder. "You know what, Mary Elizabeth? I think your grandfather raised you exactly right." But as Sam prepared to leave, he turned back to Ruth with a warning that would prove prophetic. "Ruth, you need to be careful who you trust from here on out. Word about this is going to spread, and when it does, you're going to discover that some people will do almost anything to get their hands on $200 million. Asterisk. The first sign of trouble came exactly 1 week after Sam Fletcher's visit, arriving in the form of a certified letter that required Ruth's signature and made her hand shake as she read it. Baxter Development Corporation was requesting an immediate meeting to discuss mutual interests regarding property development opportunities in the Millbrook area. The letter, written on expensive letterhead, suggested that they had recently become aware of certain property ownership questions that could affect ongoing development projects and were prepared to offer substantial compensation for cooperation in resolving these matters quickly and amicably. Ruth read the letter 3 times before its implications fully sank in. Someone had leaked information about their discovery. The carefully worded language couldn't hide the underlying message. "We know what you found, and we're prepared to pay you to make this problem go away." That afternoon, while Mary was at the small day program Ruth had arranged at the community center, Ruth drove to Thomas Bradley's law office in the county seat. The 40-minute drive gave her time to think about how dramatically their lives had changed in just a month, and how much more complicated things were about to become. Thomas's office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had been constructed in the 1920s, with tall windows that overlooked the courthouse square. His secretary, a woman named Margaret, who had known Ruth since childhood, greeted her with the kind of warmth that felt like a lifeline in an increasingly uncertain world. "Ruth, "Dear, Thomas is expecting you," Margaret said, her voice carrying undertones of concern. "He's been making phone calls all morning about your situation." Thomas Bradley rose from behind his desk as Ruth entered, his normally cheerful demeanor replaced by the serious expression of a lawyer dealing with a complex and potentially dangerous legal situation. "Ruth, I'm glad you called," he began without preamble. "We need to discuss some developments that have come to my attention since our last conversation." He gestured for her to sit in one of the leather chairs facing his desk, then opened a thick folder that contained what appeared to be several days' worth of research and correspondence. "First, the good news," Thomas continued. "I've had 3 independent legal scholars review the Mackenzie Trust documents, and they all agree that the papers are legitimate and legally binding. The survey work has been verified by the county assessor's office, and the property boundaries are exactly as described in the trust documentation." Ruth felt a flutter of relief, but Thomas's expression suggested that the good news was about to be balanced by significant complications. "The challenging news is that Baxter Development Corporation has been very busy since word of your discovery began to circulate. They filed preliminary legal challenges questioning the validity of the trust documents. They've hired a team of attorneys to research every aspect of the Mackenzie land grants, and they've begun approaching other property owners in the affected area." Thomas pulled out a map that showed the full extent of the trust lands, with different colored markers indicating various property owners and development interests. The scope was breathtaking. The trust boundaries included not just the proposed shopping complex site, but also several residential subdivisions, 2 commercial developments, and a stretch of road that carried significant traffic between the interstate and the growing suburbs to the east. "Ruth, we're not just talking about one development project anymore," Thomas said soberly. "If the trust claims are upheld, they could affect property rights and development projects worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The legal and financial implications are enormous." Ruth stared at the map, feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of what they had uncovered. "Thomas, what does this mean for Mary? What does it mean for us?" "It means that you're about to become the center of a legal battle that could last for years," Thomas replied. "It also means that Mary Elizabeth, through the trust provisions, will have the legal authority to make decisions that could affect the economic future of this entire region." He leaned forward, his expression grave. "Ruth, I need you to understand something. The people you're dealing with have vast resources and decades of experience in these kinds of disputes. They will use every legal tactic available to challenge the trust documents, and they will not hesitate to make your life difficult if they believe it will advance their interests." Ruth felt a chill of fear. "Are you saying we're in danger?" "I'm saying you need to be very careful about who you trust and how you handle this situation from now on," Thomas replied. "The amount of money involved changes everything. People who seemed friendly and supportive may develop different attitudes when they realize what's at stake." As if to prove his point, Ruth's phone rang while they were talking. The caller ID showed Sam Fletcher's number, but when Ruth answered, Sam's voice carried a tension she had never heard before. "Ruth, where are you right now?" Sam asked without his usual greeting. "I'm at Thomas Bradley's office." "Why?" "Because there are 3 cars with out-of-state license plates parked outside your house, and 2 men in suits knocked on my door an hour ago, asking questions about you and Mary Elizabeth. They said they represent interested parties who want to discuss property matters." Ruth felt her heart start to race. "What did you tell them?" "I told them I don't discuss my neighbor's business with strangers," Sam replied grimly. "But Ruth, these aren't local people making friendly inquiries. These are professional investigators, and they're not going to give up easily." Thomas had been listening to Ruth's end of the conversation, and when she hung up, he was already reaching for his phone. "We need to accelerate our legal preparations," he said. I'm calling my colleague Susan Martinez in the state capitol. She specializes in complex property law and has experience dealing with large development corporations. If we're going to protect Mary's interests, we need legal representation that can match what the other side is bringing to this fight. As Thomas made his calls, Ruth sat in the leather chair and tried to process how quickly their situation had escalated. 3 weeks ago, she had been a recently widowed woman learning to care for an orphaned little girl. Now, she was apparently the guardian of a child whose inheritance could affect the economic future of an entire region. The drive back to Millbrook seemed longer than usual, and Ruth found herself checking her rearview mirror repeatedly to see if she was being followed. The paranoia felt ridiculous, but Thomas's warnings and Sam's phone call had shattered any illusions she might have had about this being a simple legal matter that could be resolved quietly. When she pulled into her driveway, the strange cars Sam had mentioned were gone, but she could see curtains twitching in neighbors' windows as she parked. Word was spreading through the small community, and Ruth realized that their private discovery was about to become very public knowledge. Mary, Elizabeth, was waiting for her in the living room, her small suitcase packed and sitting by the door. "Miss Ruth," Mary said with the calm determination that continued to amaze Ruth, "I think we should go stay at the church tonight. Grandpa William always said that when troubles come, the safest place to be is close to God." Looking at this wise little girl, Ruth realized that Mary Elizabeth understood their situation better than most adults would. They were no longer just inheriting a building and some land. They were inheriting a battle that would test everything they believed about faith, community, and the power of ordinary people to stand up against forces much larger than themselves. That first night at the church taught Ruth more about courage than she had learned in 62 years of living. They made beds from sleeping bags and pillows in the front pew, and as darkness settled over the old building, Mary Elizabeth fell asleep with the same peaceful expression she wore at Ruth's house, as if sleeping in a drafty church with bucket caught. Rainwater dripping in the background was perfectly normal. Ruth, however, lay awake listening to every sound, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through loose window frames, and the distant hum of traffic on the interstate that represented the commercial forces now aligned against them. Around midnight, she heard a car drive slowly past the church, its headlights sweeping across the stained glass windows before continuing down the road. Morning brought Susan Martinez, the attorney Thomas Bradley had contacted. Ruth had expected another middle-aged professional in a conservative suit, but Susan turned out to be a woman in her early 40s with silver-streaked black hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had won more legal battles than she had lost. Susan arrived in a practical Honda Civic rather than the luxury car Ruth had anticipated, and she spent the first hour walking the church property with a surveyor's attention to detail, taking photographs and making notes in a tablet computer that seemed incongruously modern against the 19th century landscape. "Mrs. Morrison," Susan said when they finally sat down in the church kitchen with coffee Ruth had made on a small camping stove, "I've reviewed all the documentation Thomas sent me, and I need you to understand both the strength of your legal position and the challenges you're facing." Mary Elizabeth sat quietly at the small table, coloring in a book while listening with the careful attention she brought to all adult conversations that concerned her future. "The legal strength of the Mackenzie Trust documents is remarkable," Susan continued. Jonathan Mackenzie was obviously a man who understood the importance of detailed legal planning. His instructions were specific, his intentions were clear, and the documentation was properly executed according to the laws in effect at the time. She opened her tablet to show Ruth a digital copy of the original trust deed, with certain passages highlighted in yellow. "The key provision is this paragraph," Susan said, pointing to a section written in Mackenzie's formal 19th century language. All community lands designated for the perpetual benefit of Millbrook residents shall remain under the stewardship of the community church, with decisions regarding development or use requiring the consent of the church's designated guardian to be determined by each successive generation according to the community's spiritual and material needs. Ruth read the passage twice before its full implications became clear. This means that Mary, as the church's owner, actually has veto power over any development on all the trust lands? More than veto power, Susan replied. According to the trust provisions, she has the authority to approve or reject any proposed use of the land, and any development that proceeds without her consent would be legally invalid. Mary looked up from her coloring book. Does that mean I can decide what happens to all the land Grandpa William's treasure map showed us? Susan studied the little girl with the kind of careful attention lawyers usually reserved for crucial witnesses. Yes, Mary Elizabeth, it does. But it also means that a lot of people are going to try very hard to influence your decisions. As if summoned by Susan's words, the sound of multiple vehicles arriving in the church parking lot interrupted their conversation. Through the kitchen window, Ruth could see 3 cars, 2 expensive sedans, and a large SUV disgorging men and women in business attire who moved with the purposeful coordination of a military operation. That would be the opposition, Susan said calmly, closing her tablet and standing up. Mrs. Morrison, I need you to let me handle this conversation. Don't agree to anything, don't sign anything, and don't make any commitments beyond basic politeness. The knock on the church's front door was firm but not aggressive, the kind of professional courtesy that preceded serious business negotiations. Ruth opened the door to find 5 people arranged in a semicircle, led by a woman in her 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed designed to inspire trust. Mrs. Morrison, I'm Jennifer Whitfield from Baxter Development Corporation, the woman said, extending a manicured hand. I wonder if we might have a few minutes of your time to discuss some matters of mutual interest. Ruth noticed that Jennifer's companions included 2 men who looked like lawyers, a younger woman carrying a briefcase full of documents, and an older man whose expensive suit and confident posture suggested he was accustomed to getting his way in important negotiations. I'm Susan Martinez, representing Mrs. Morrison and Mary Elizabeth in all legal matters, Susan said, stepping forward before Ruth could respond. Any discussions regarding the church property need to include legal counsel. Jennifer's smile flickered for just a moment before recovering its professional warmth. Of course. We're simply hoping to clarify some property ownership questions that have come to our attention, and to explore whether there might be mutually beneficial solutions to what appears to be a complex situation. They gathered in the church sanctuary, an incongruous setting for what was clearly going to be a high-stakes business negotiation. The visitors took seats in the front pews, while Ruth, Mary, and Susan sat across the aisle in what felt like a confrontation between 2 very different WORLDVI, EWS. The older man, who introduced himself as Richard Baxter, the company's founder, took the lead in presenting their position. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. Mrs. Morrison, we understand that you've recently discovered some historical documents that suggest your church property may have different boundaries than previously understood. Richard began. While we respect your desire to explore these claims, we're concerned about the potential impact on ongoing development, projects that represent millions of dollars in investment and hundreds of jobs for the local community. Mary Elizabeth raised her hand like she was in school. Mr. Baxter, are you the person who wants to build the big shopping place where the old farm used to be? Richard's expression softened into what was probably meant to be a grandfatherly smile. That's right, sweetheart. We're trying to bring new businesses and opportunities to your community. But these old land documents might make that more complicated than it needs to be. Why? Mary asked with the directness that adults often found unsettling. Well, Richard said, glancing at his colleagues before continuing, sometimes old papers don't reflect the way things actually work in the modern world. What we'd like to propose is a solution that would give you and Mrs. Morrison a very generous payment in exchange for helping us resolve these property questions quickly and quietly. Jennifer opened the briefcase and withdrew a document that was clearly a prepared contract. We're prepared to offer $2 million for a simple agreement that would allow our current development projects to proceed without legal challenges. Ruth felt her breath catch. $2 million was more money than she had ever imagined possessing, enough to secure Mary's future education and provide them with a comfortable life free from financial worry. But Mary Elizabeth's response surprised everyone in the sanctuary. "Mr. Baxter, did you ask the families who used to live on that farmland if they wanted you to build a shopping place there?" Richard's carefully maintained composure showed its first crack. "Sweetheart, that's how business works. When people decide to sell their land, they can choose what to do with the money they receive." "But what if they didn't really want to sell?" Mary asked. "What if they thought they had to because they needed money for important things like medicine or fixing their houses?" Ruth realized that this 6-year-old child was asking questions that cut to the heart of the ethical issues surrounding the entire development project. Mary had somehow intuited that the power represented by the Mackenzie trust documents wasn't just about money. It was about whether communities had the right to determine their own futures. Susan leaned forward slightly, and Ruth could see that she was impressed by Mary's line of questioning. "Mr. Baxter," Susan said, "before we consider any proposals, we'd like to understand the full scope of the development projects that might be affected by the trust documents. Could you provide us with a complete list of properties and planned developments that would be impacted if the Mackenzie Trust boundaries are legally confirmed?" The brief silence that followed Susan's request told Ruth everything she needed to know about how much larger this situation was than anyone had initially revealed. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Richard Baxter's carefully composed expression shifted into something harder and more calculating. Ruth realized that Susan's question had forced him to make a choice between continuing the friendly negotiation facade or revealing the true scope of what was at stake. "Ms. Martinez," Richard said slowly, "I think you're asking us to disclose proprietary business information that goes well beyond the scope of this particular property discussion. I'm asking you to be honest about how many people's lives and livelihoods could be affected by the decisions that Mary Elizabeth might make regarding the trust lands," Susan replied evenly. "Because if you're asking a 6-year-old child to sign away rights that could impact dozens of families and millions of dollars in development projects, then she deserves to understand the full picture." Jennifer Whitfield intervened with renewed diplomatic energy. "Perhaps we're getting ahead of ourselves," she said, directing her attention toward Ruth. "Mrs. Morrison, we understand that this situation is overwhelming, and we're not trying to pressure anyone into making hasty decisions. What we're offering is a generous payment that would allow you to avoid years of expensive legal battles while ensuring that beneficial community development can proceed." Mary Elizabeth had been listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention she brought to everything that concerned her future. When Jennifer finished speaking, Mary raised her hand again. "Mrs. Whitfield, how much money would the shopping place make for your company?" Jennifer's smile became noticeably strained. "Sweetheart, that's a very complicated business question. That involves many different factors." "But more than $2 million? Mary pressed. "Over time, yes, but how much more?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Ruth could see that Mary's innocent directness was accomplishing something that hours of adult negotiation might not have achieved. She was forcing the development representatives to reveal information they hadn't intended to share. Richard Baxter's. Patience was clearly wearing thin. Young lady, business investments involve risks and long-term planning that are difficult to explain to someone your age. I'm 6, Mary said matter-of-factly. But Grandpa William always said that if someone can't explain something in simple words, it usually means they're trying to hide something important. Ruth felt a surge of pride in this remarkable child who was holding her own in a negotiation with experienced corporate executives. But she also sensed that the friendly atmosphere was about to disappear entirely. Susan apparently reached the same conclusion. Mr. Baxter, I think we've heard enough to understand your initial position. We'll need time to review all the legal implications and discuss our options. We'll be in touch through proper legal channels if we decide to pursue further negotiations. Richard stood up with the abrupt movement of someone unaccustomed to being dismissed. Ms. Martinez, I hope you'll advise your clients to consider the practical realities of this situation. Legal battles are expensive, time-consuming, and unpredictable. Our offer represents a generous resolution that avoids unnecessary complications for everyone involved. And if we decide that the trust provisions should be upheld as written, Susan asked, the mask of corporate politeness finally slipped completely. Then you'll discover how difficult life can become when you're standing in the way of projects that represent hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. Courts don't always side with idealistic interpretations of century-old documents, especially when practical economic interests are at stake. Mary Elizabeth looked up at Richard with the kind of clear-eyed assessment that children use when they're trying to understand adult behavior. Mr. Baxter, are you trying to scare us? I'm trying to help you understand the consequences of unrealistic expectations, Richard replied, his voice carrying undertones that were no longer even attempting to sound friendly. After the development team left, Ruth, Mary, and Susan sat in the empty sanctuary processing what had just occurred. The buckets catching rainwater from the damaged roof seemed to emphasize the contrast between their humble circumstances and the vast corporate resources arrayed against them. Susan, what just happened here? Ruth asked. Were they threatening the U.S.? They were doing what development corporations always do when they encounter unexpected obstacles, Susan replied. They offered money first, then implied consequences if the money is refused. The next phase will probably involve legal challenges to the trust documents, attempts to pressure local officials, and possibly some unpleasant media attention designed to make you look like obstacles to community progress. Mary had been unusually quiet since the visitors left. Finally, she looked up at the two adults with an expression that was both thoughtful and determined. Miss Ruth, can we go visit the families who live on the land that Mr. Baxter wants to use? I think we should ask them what they want before we decide anything. Ruth felt her heart skip a beat. The simple wisdom of Mary's suggestion was both obvious and profound. In all the legal discussions about property rights and development projects, no one had talked about consulting the people who would be most directly affected by whatever decisions were made. Mary Elizabeth, that's a wonderful idea, Susan said. In fact, it's exactly what the original trust provisions would have required. Jonathan Mackenzie specifically stated that decisions about community land should reflect the needs and wishes of the community residents. Over the next 3 days, Ruth and Mary embarked on what felt like a journey through the hidden stories of their community. Armed with the survey maps that showed the true boundaries of the trust lands, they visited families who had no idea that their property rights were about to become the center of a legal battle. The conversations were eye-opening and heartbreaking. They met elderly couples who had been pressured to sell family farms because they couldn't afford rising property taxes on land that developers were eager to acquire. They talked to young families who had purchased homes in subdivisions without realizing that their deeds might not be legally valid if the trust claims were upheld. Most surprising were the number of people who expressed relief When they learned about the trust provisions, many residents had felt powerless to stop development projects that were changing the character of their community, and the idea that they might have legal recourse through the church trust gave them hope they hadn't felt in years. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, whose family had owned a small farm for 3 generations, summarized the situation with painful clarity. "We never wanted to sell, but when they offered us more money than we'd ever seen, and when the property taxes kept going up, we felt like we didn't have a choice. If there's a way to keep families like ours from being forced out, then maybe this community can stay the kind of place where people actually know their neighbors." But the visits also revealed the complexity of their situation. Some families had invested their life savings in homes that might not have clear legal title. Others had made business decisions based on development projects that might now be legally questionable. Ruth realized that whatever decisions they made about the trust lands would affect real people in ways that couldn't be easily undone. The $2 million offer from Baxter Development was beginning to seem not just inadequate, but almost insulting in light of the community-wide implications of their inheritance. As they drove home from their final visit that week, Mary asked the question that had been growing in Ruth's mind. "Miss Ruth, what if Grandpa William left us the church and the land because he knew we'd try to do the right thing for everyone, not just for us?" The call came at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday, jarring Ruth from the deepest sleep she had managed in weeks. Susan Martinez's voice carried an urgency that immediately banished any lingering drowsiness. "Ruth, I need you and Mary to come to my office immediately. Don't talk to anyone on the way. Don't answer any questions from reporters. And bring Pastor William's document box with you." "Reporters?" Ruth asked, her stomach clenching with dread. The story broke in this morning's paper. Someone leaked details about the trust discovery, and it's front-page news. But that's not the most important development. I've discovered something about the Mackenzie Trust that changes everything. The drive to Susan's office felt like navigating through a gauntlet. 2 news vans were parked outside Ruth's house, and she could see reporters with cameras stationed near the church property. Mary Elizabeth sat quietly in the passenger seat, observing the commotion with the calm acceptance that had become her hallmark in dealing with adult chaos. "Miss Ruth, why are all those people interested in our church?" Mary asked as they passed the 3rd news van. "Because when something involves a lot of money, people think it becomes everyone's business," Ruth replied, though she was beginning to suspect that the media attention was orchestrated rather than spontaneous. Susan's office was a haven of calm professionalism in what felt like a storm of public scrutiny. But when Ruth and Mary entered the conference room, they found Susan surrounded by documents, computer printouts, and legal books that suggested she had been working through the night. "Ruth, sit down," Susan said without preamble. "What I'm about to tell you will completely change how we understand this situation." She opened Pastor William's document box and removed the original Mackenzie Trust papers, spreading them across the conference table alongside newer documents that Ruth hadn't seen before. "Yesterday, after our conversations with the affected families, I decided to research Jonathan Mackenzie more thoroughly. I wanted to understand his motivations for creating such an unusual land trust, and I wanted to verify that all the legal provisions were exactly as they appeared." Susan pulled out a leather-bound journal that looked similar to Pastor William's research notes, but much older. "This is Jonathan Mackenzie's personal diary, held in the State Historical Archives. I obtained copies of the relevant entries yesterday afternoon, and what I found completely reframes everything we thought we knew about the trust." She opened the journal to a page marked with a yellow sticky note. This entry is dated March 15th, 1893, about a year before Mackenzie's death. "Listen to this. The railroad surveys have confirmed what I suspected. There are significant mineral deposits beneath the Millbrook community lands. Coal, possibly iron ore, and what the geologists believe may be substantial natural gas reserves. I must ensure that any future development of these resources benefits the community rather than outside investors who would extract the wealth and leave the residents with nothing. Ruth felt the room spinning slightly. Susan, are you saying that the land contains valuable mineral deposits? I'm saying that Jonathan Mackenzie knew about mineral deposits, and that knowledge influenced how he structured the trust provisions. But here's the truly significant discovery. Susan turned to another marked page in the journal. This entry from June 1893. I have consulted with the finest legal minds in the state capital to ensure that the community trust will retain all mineral rights in perpetuity. The land may be used for agriculture, residential development, or appropriate commercial purposes, but any mineral extraction must be approved by the community's designated steward and must provide ongoing benefit to all residents. Mary Elizabeth had been listening with the focused attention she brought to all important adult conversations. Miss Ruth, does that mean there's treasure under the ground too? More than treasure, sweetheart, Susan replied. Modern geological surveys suggest that the trust lands may sit above one of the largest natural gas reserves in the region. Conservative estimates place the potential value at over $500 million, with annual royalty payments that could continue for decades. Ruth stared at the documents, trying to process information that seemed too extraordinary to be real. Susan, how did Pastor William know about this? Did he know about the mineral rights when he left the church to Mary? Susan reached into the document box and withdrew a folder that Ruth had assumed contained routine correspondence. Pastor William knew everything. Look at this. The folder contained correspondence between Pastor William and geological consulting firms dating back over 2 years. He had commissioned private surveys of the church property, researched mineral rights law, and even consulted with energy companies about the potential for natural gas extraction. One letter, dated 6 months before Pastor William's death, was from a consulting geologist who had surveyed the church property. The technical language was dense, but the conclusion was clear. Preliminary core samples indicated substantial natural gas deposits that could be accessed through modern horizontal drilling techniques with minimal surface disruption. Pastor Williams' handwritten notes in the margins revealed his thinking. The financial resources to restore the community could come from beneath the ground, but only if managed by someone who will prioritize community benefit over personal profit. Mary Elizabeth, with proper guidance, will have the wisdom to use these resources for their intended purpose. Ruth, Susan said slowly, we're not just talking about land development rights anymore. We're talking about energy resources that could transform the economic future of this entire region. And according to the trust provisions, Mary Elizabeth has the legal authority to control how those resources are developed. The implications hit Ruth like a physical blow. No wonder Baxter Development had been so aggressive in their negotiations. And no wonder the story had leaked to the media. They weren't just trying to build a shopping complex. They were trying to gain control of mineral rights worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The mineral rights explain everything, Susan continued. The pressure to resolve the property questions quickly, the generous but inadequate buyout offer, the veiled threats about legal complications. Baxter Development has probably known about the natural gas deposits for months, and they've been systematically acquiring property rights from owners who had no idea what was beneath their land. Mary Elizabeth climbed down from her chair and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse square. When she turned back to face the adults, her expression carried a seriousness that seemed far beyond her 6 years. Miss Ruth, if there's enough money to help all the families in our community, then we have to make sure it's used right. Grandpa William trusted us to take care of people, not just to get rich. Ruth felt tears prick at her eyes. This remarkable child had just articulated the central moral challenge of their situation with a clarity that cut through all the legal complexities and financial projections. Susan closed the geological reports and looked at Ruth with an expression that mixed professional admiration with personal concern. "Ruth, Mary Elizabeth is absolutely right about the trust responsibilities, but you need to understand what you're up against now. We're not dealing with a local development project anymore. We're dealing with energy companies, mineral rights, speculators, and potentially state and federal regulatory agencies. The legal and political pressure is going to be intense. What do you recommend?" Ruth asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "I recommend that we fight," Susan said firmly. The Mackenzie Trust was designed exactly for this situation to ensure that natural resources benefit the community rather than outside corporate interests. But it's going to require legal representation, public advocacy, and political support that goes far beyond what I can provide alone. Mary Elizabeth returned to her chair and looked at the two adults with the kind of determined expression Ruth had learned to respect. "Miss Ruth, can we call all the families we visited and ask them to help us? If the treasure under the ground belongs to everyone, then everyone should help decide what to do with it." Ruth realized that Mary Elizabeth had just proposed a strategy that could make the difference between success and failure. Instead of fighting this battle alone, they could mobilize the entire community around the vision that Jonathan Mackenzie had articulated over a century ago. A place where ordinary families could benefit from the natural wealth of their land rather than watching it be extracted by distant corporations. But as Ruth looked at the stack of legal documents and geological reports, she also realized that they were about to enter a conflict that would test everything they believed about faith, community, and the power of ordinary people to stand up for what was right. Asterisk. The community meeting that would determine the future of Millbrook took place on a crisp Saturday evening in early November, 6 weeks after Ruth and Mary had discovered the hidden documents. The old church building had been transformed for the occasion. Sam Fletcher and a crew of volunteers had worked through the previous weekend to repair the roof, replace broken windows, and restore the sanctuary to a condition that Pastor William would have recognized with pride. Over 90 people crowded into the pews, representing nearly every family affected by the Mackenzie Trust boundaries. Ruth stood at the front of the sanctuary with Mary Elizabeth beside her, facing neighbors and friends whose lives would be fundamentally changed by whatever decisions emerged from this gathering. Susan Martinez had spent the previous month building a legal and political coalition that reached far beyond Millbrook's borders. Environmental groups supported the community-controlled development model. Rural advocacy organizations saw the Mackenzie Trust as a template for protecting agricultural communities from corporate exploitation. Even some energy companies had expressed interest in negotiating mineral rights agreements with community stewards rather than dealing with the legal uncertainties created by disputed property claims. But the opposition had been equally busy. Baxter Development had hired a public relations firm that flooded local media with stories about the economic benefits of their development projects and the dangers of allowing untested legal theories to block progress. They had also filed formal legal challenges to the trust documents, claiming that century-old provisions couldn't be enforced against modern property owners who had purchased their land in good faith. The meeting began with Pastor William's successor, a young minister named David Chun, who had volunteered to facilitate the discussion, reading aloud from Jonathan Mackenzie's original trust charter. The formal 19th century language seemed to echo with particular resonance in the restored sanctuary. "It is my intention that these lands shall serve the perpetual benefit of families who choose to make their homes in this community, and that any natural wealth discovered beneath these lands shall be developed in a manner that strengthens rather than diminishes the bonds of neighborly care and mutual support that are the foundation of any truly prosperous society." Elena Vasquez, The farmer whose family had been pressured to sell their land was the first to speak. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had wrestled with difficult decisions and learned to trust her own judgment. 6 months ago, my family thought we had no choice but to sell our farm to developers who offered us more money than we'd ever seen but gave us no say in what would happen to the land that had been our home for 3 generations. Tonight, for the first time in years, we're being asked what we actually want for our community's future. She turned to face Mary Elizabeth, who sat in the front pew with the kind of attention that adults usually reserved for matters of life and death. Mary Elizabeth, your grandfather was the one who married my parents, baptized my children, and buried my husband's father. He knew this community, and he knew that outside money isn't always good money if it comes with the price of losing control over our own lives. A man named Robert Chang, who owned a small construction company, raised his hand to speak. Mrs. Vasquez, I respect what you're saying, but we have to be realistic. My business depends on the development projects that bring work to this area. If we block every development proposal because of century-old documents, we're going to drive away the economic opportunities that our young people need. Mary Elizabeth raised her small hand, and Pastor Chun acknowledged her with the seriousness he would have shown any adult participant. Mr. Chang, what if the natural gas money could pay for projects that create jobs for people who live here? Instead of companies from far away building things and then leaving, couldn't we use the treasure under the ground to help people in our community start businesses and build things we actually need? Robert considered her question with the care it deserved. Mary Elizabeth, that's a beautiful idea, but it would require planning and management skills that most of us don't have. How do we know that community control would work better than letting experienced companies handle the development? Susan Martinez stood to address Robert's concern. Mr. Chang, that's exactly the right question. And it's why we've spent the past month consulting with community development experts, energy economists, and legal specialists in mineral rights management. She gestured toward a table at the side of the sanctuary where she had displayed charts, financial projections, and examples of successful community-controlled resource development from other regions. What we've learned is that community ownership of natural resources, when properly structured, consistently produces better long-term economic outcomes for residents than corporate extraction models. The key is professional management combined with democratic oversight, exactly what the Mackenzie Trust provisions were designed to ensure. Margaret Thompson, an elderly woman who had taught school in Millbrook for 40 years, stood slowly and spoke with the quiet authority that comes from decades of watching communities change. I've seen 3 different waves of outside development come through this area in my lifetime. Each time, we were promised jobs, prosperity, and community improvement. Each time, the companies extracted what they wanted and left us with environmental problems, infrastructure needs, and young people who had to leave town to find decent work. She looked directly at Mary Elizabeth with something approaching reverence. Child, you've been given a responsibility that most adults would find overwhelming, but you've also been given an opportunity that most communities never receive. The chance to control your own economic future instead of hoping that distant corporations will consider your welfare when they make their decisions. Thomas Bradley, the lawyer who had first delivered news of Mary's inheritance, raised a concern that had been troubling Ruth for weeks. Mrs. Morrison, Ms. Martinez, I appreciate the idealism behind community-controlled development, but we need to address the practical reality that Mary Elizabeth is 6 years old. How do we ensure that decisions affecting hundreds of millions of dollars are made responsibly, especially when she won't reach legal majority for 12 more years? Pastor Chun looked to Mary Elizabeth, who had been listening to the adult conversation. With the focused attention she brought to everything that concerned her future responsibilities. Pastor Chun, may I answer Mr. Bradley's question? Mary asked politely. "Of course, Mary Elizabeth." Mary stood up and faced the gathering with a composure that seemed remarkable in someone so young. When she spoke, her voice carried clearly to the back of the sanctuary. "Mr. Bradley, Grandpa William always told me that the most important decisions are too important to make alone. He said that's why churches have congregations, and families have conversations, and communities have meetings, like this one." She gestured toward the crowded pews around her. "I think the treasure under the ground and the money from the gas belong to all of us, not just to me. So I think all of us should help make the decisions about what to do with them. I can't vote yet, but everyone else can, and Miss Ruth can help me understand what everyone decides." Ruth felt her heart swell with pride and amazement. This remarkable child had just proposed a solution that was both legally sound and ethically grounded: community democratic control with professional management. Exactly what the Mackenzie Trust provisions had envisioned. Sam Fletcher stood up from the back of the sanctuary. "Mary Elizabeth, are you saying that you want to give the community voting rights over decisions about the trust lands?" "I'm saying I think that's what Grandpa William would want," Mary replied. "He always said that when God gives you a gift, it's because he trusts you to share it with people who need it." The silence that followed Mary's statement felt like a moment of collective decision-making. Ruth could see neighbors looking at each other with expressions that suggested they were beginning to understand the magnitude of the opportunity and responsibility that had been placed before them. Susan Martinez stood to address the legal implications of Mary's proposal. "If the community chooses to move forward with this approach, we would need to establish a legal structure that protects Mary Elizabeth's ultimate ownership rights while creating democratic mechanisms for community input on all major decisions. It's complex, but it's absolutely achievable." Elena Vasquez raised her hand again. "Ms. Martinez, what happens if we choose community control and the development companies refuse to accept our decisions? What if they challenge us in court or try to pressure us economically?" "Then we fight," Susan replied simply. "But we fight with legal resources, political support, and public attention that makes it very expensive for corporations to bully communities that are standing up for their rights." Mary Elizabeth tugged on Ruth's sleeve and whispered something that only Ruth could hear. Ruth nodded and looked toward Pastor Chun. "Pastor Chun, Mary Elizabeth would like to ask the community a question." Mary stood up again and faced the gathering. With the kind of seriousness that suggested she understood this was the most important moment of her young life. "Everyone here tonight, would you help me take care of the treasure that Grandpa William left us? Not just the money, but the families and the land and the church and everything that makes this place special." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Hands rose throughout the sanctuary, voices called out agreement, and Ruth realized that Mary Elizabeth had just accomplished something that experienced politicians and community organizers sometimes spend years trying to achieve. She had united a diverse group of people around a shared vision of their future. But as Ruth looked around the sanctuary at the faces of neighbors and friends who were committing themselves to an unprecedented experiment in community democracy, she also realized that the real test was just beginning. The legal battle that would determine whether the Millbrook community could control its own economic future began 3 days after the community meeting, when Baxter Development filed for an emergency injunction claiming that the Mackenzie Trust documents were fraudulent and that any delay in their development projects would cause irreparable financial harm. Ruth stood in the federal courthouse in the state capitol, wearing the same dark blue dress she had worn to Harold's funeral, holding Mary Elizabeth's hand as they faced the most important legal proceeding of their lives. The courtroom was packed with residents from Millbrook, environmental activists, rural advocacy groups, and corporate lawyers whose expensive suits seemed designed to intimidate anyone who dared challenge their clients' authority. Judge Patricia Hendricks, A woman in her 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she had presided over more than her share of complex property disputes, called the proceedings to order with the kind of firm authority that immediately commanded respect from everyone in the room. Baxter Development's lead attorney, a man named Charles Morrison, who carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning high-stakes legal battles, presented their case with polished efficiency. He argued that the Mackenzie Trust documents were legally obsolete, that modern property owners couldn't be held hostage to 19th-century provisions that were never properly integrated into contemporary land use law, and that allowing the trust claims to proceed would create chaos in property rights throughout the region. "Your Honor," Charles said, gesturing toward a stack of legal briefs that represented months of research and preparation. "The plaintiffs are asking this court to overturn a century of established property transactions based on documents that were never properly filed with county authorities and provisions that have no basis in modern real estate law." Susan Martinez rose to respond with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your case is built on solid legal and moral foundations. She had spent the previous week preparing not just legal arguments, but a comprehensive presentation that would help Judge Hendricks understand the historical context and community implications of the Mackenzie Trust. "Your Honor, the plaintiffs are not asking this court to overturn established property rights. We are asking this court to recognize property rights that have existed continuously since 1889, but were systematically ignored or misrepresented by parties who had financial interests in developing community land without community consent." Susan presented a timeline that showed how the original trust boundaries had been gradually obscured through mapping errors, selective filing of documents, and what appeared to be deliberate attempts to separate mineral rights from surface rights. Without proper legal authority, Mary Elizabeth sat quietly beside Ruth, her small hands folded in her lap, watching the legal proceedings with the kind of serious attention that had impressed everyone who met her. When Judge Hendricks called for a brief recess, Mary tugged on Ruth's sleeve. "Miss Ruth, why is the man in the expensive suit trying to make it sound like helping our community is a bad thing?" Ruth struggled to find words that would explain adult motivations that she herself found difficult to understand. "Sweetheart, sometimes when people have invested a lot of money in something, they become afraid of losing it, even if what they're doing isn't right." When the proceedings resumed, Judge Hendricks surprised everyone by asking to hear directly from community representatives who would be affected by her decision. Elena Vasquez spoke about her family's experience with development pressure. Sam Fletcher explained the construction and maintenance challenges facing rural communities. And Margaret Thompson described the long-term economic impacts of corporate resource extraction. But it was Mary Elizabeth's testimony that created the most profound moment in the courtroom. When Judge Hendricks asked if she understood the responsibility that came with her inheritance, Mary stood up and spoke with the clarity that had become her hallmark. "Your Honor, my grandfather always told me that when you inherit something important, you don't really own it, you take care of it for the people who come after you. I think the land and the treasure under the ground were left to me so I could help take care of everyone in our community, not so I could get rich by myself." Judge Hendricks studied Mary with an expression that mixed legal analysis with personal reflection. "Mary Elizabeth, do you understand that the decisions made about this trust could affect your financial future for the rest of your life?" "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied. "But I also understand that if I make decisions that hurt my neighbors, then the money wouldn't make me happy anyway." Asterisk, asterisk. Judge Hendricks recessed the court for 2 hours to review the legal briefs and documentary evidence, leaving Ruth, Mary, and their supporters to wait in the courthouse hallway with the kind of nervous energy that accompanies life-changing decisions. Charles Morrison approached Ruth during the recess with an offer that revealed the desperation behind Baxter Development's aggressive legal strategy. "Mrs. Morrison, my clients are prepared to increase their settlement offer to $5 million. plus guaranteed construction jobs for Millbrook residents, if you'll agree to a consent decree that allows their current projects to proceed without further legal challenges. Ruth looked at the man who represented corporate interests worth hundreds of millions of dollars and realized that his willingness to negotiate during a court recess proved that Baxter Development was not confident about winning their legal arguments. "Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your client's offer, but the decision about the trust lands belongs to the community now, not to me or Mary Elizabeth alone." When Judge Hendricks reconvened the court, her expression suggested that she had reached a decision that would satisfy no one completely, but would serve the interests of justice as she understood them. "The court finds that the Mackenzie Trust documents are legally valid and binding," Judge Hendricks announced, her voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom. "The evidence presented demonstrates that Jonathan Mackenzie created a legitimate community land trust with specific provisions for democratic stewardship of natural resources." Ruth felt Mary Elizabeth squeeze her hand as supporters in the gallery behind them released held breath in what sounded like a collective sigh of relief. But Judge Hendricks wasn't finished. "However," she continued, "the court also recognizes that upholding these provisions creates significant complications for property owners who purchase their land in good faith, believing they held clear title. Therefore, the court is ordering a structured resolution process that protects both the trust's community stewardship provisions and the legitimate interests of current property owners." Susan Martinez leaned forward, trying to understand the full implications of the judge's ruling. Judge Hendricks explained that her decision created a framework for negotiated agreements between the trust and current property owners, with financial compensation for any development rights that needed to be transferred back to community control. The court would appoint a special master to oversee the process, and any development of mineral resources would require approval from both the trust stewards and affected property owners. "Most importantly," Judge Hendricks said, looking directly at Mary Elizabeth, "the court finds that the trust provisions explicitly require community democratic participation in all major decisions affecting the trust lands. Miss Mary Elizabeth McKinney, as the designated steward, will work with the community council to be elected by residents of the affected area." Charles Morrison immediately announced Baxter Development's intention to appeal the decision, but Judge Hendricks' ruling had created a legal framework that would be difficult to overturn. The Mackenzie Trust was officially recognized, community democratic control was legally established, and the path forward required cooperation rather than corporate domination. As they left the courthouse, Ruth realized that they had won something more valuable than a legal victory. They had established a precedent for communities to maintain control over their own economic futures. The celebration that evening at the restored church felt like a combination of homecoming and new beginning. The sanctuary was filled with neighbors, friends, and supporters who had traveled from across the state to witness the culmination of their legal battle. Mary Elizabeth stood at the front of the sanctuary, where her grandfather had delivered thousands of sermons, facing a congregation that now included people who had committed themselves to an experiment in community democracy that would be watched by rural communities throughout the country. "Everyone," Mary said, her clear voice carrying to the back of the crowded sanctuary, "we won in court today, but that was the easy part. Now, we have to prove that regular people can make good decisions about important things when we work together and listen to each other." Sam Fletcher stood to address the gathering. "Mary Elizabeth, you've given us something that most communities never get a real chance to control our own future. But you've also given us a responsibility to show that community ownership can work better than corporate ownership." Elena Vasquez raised her hand to speak. "Mary Elizabeth, my family wants to be part of the community council that helps make decisions about the trust lands. We've learned that when ordinary people don't participate in important decisions, then powerful people make those decisions for us. As the evening continued, neighbors volunteered for various responsibilities: legal research, financial planning, environmental assessment, and community outreach. Ruth watched Mary Elizabeth moving through the crowd, thanking people for their support and listening to their ideas about how the trust resources should be developed. At the end of the evening, as the last supporters were leaving the church, Mary Elizabeth walked to the altar and knelt in the spot where Pastor William had prayed for 40 years. "Grandpa William," she whispered, "I think we did what you wanted us to do. We kept the treasure safe for everyone." Ruth knelt beside Mary, feeling the presence of Pastor William's spirit in the restored sanctuary, and realized that their legal victory was just the beginning of the most important work they would ever do. 5 years later, Ruth stood in the same sanctuary where their remarkable journey had begun, watching Mary Elizabeth practice a speech she would deliver to a national conference on community-controlled resource development. At 11 years old, Mary had become an articulate advocate for democratic stewardship, traveling to rural communities across the country to share the lessons learned from the Millbrook experience. The church building itself had been transformed into a community center that served as headquarters for the Mackenzie Trust Council, a democratically elected body that now managed natural gas royalties worth over $30 million annually. The old sanctuary hosted monthly town meetings where residents made collective decisions about community investments, and the former pastor's office had become a resource center where other communities could learn about establishing their own democratic land trusts. The trust's success had exceeded everyone's expectations. Instead of the economic disruption that Baxter Development had predicted, Millbrook was experiencing the most sustainable prosperity in its history. The community had used natural gas royalties to fund a cooperative business development program that had created over 200 jobs, all owned by local residents. Young people who had planned to leave for opportunities in larger cities were now staying to start businesses, raise families, and participate in an economic model that prioritized community welfare over individual profit. Elena Vasquez had been elected as the first chair of the Trust Council, bringing decades of farming experience to the challenge of balancing economic development with environmental protection. Sam Fletcher had established a worker-owned construction cooperative that specialized in energy-efficient housing and had contracts to build similar projects in 3 neighboring counties. Margaret Thompson, now in her 70s, directed an educational program that brought students from universities across the region to study community-controlled resource management. But the most significant transformation had been in the relationships between neighbors. The monthly town meetings had created a culture of democratic participation that extended far beyond trust business. Residents had established cooperative childcare, community-supported agriculture, and volunteer programs that addressed everything from elder care to environmental restoration. Ruth's own life had been transformed as well. Her role as Mary Elizabeth's guardian had evolved into serving as the Trust's community liaison, helping other rural communities understand how democratic resource management could work in their specific circumstances. The work had restored her sense of purpose and her faith in the possibility of positive change, though she still missed Harold's wisdom and support in navigating the complexities of public life. The legal challenges from Baxter Development had been resolved through a settlement that compensated them for their preliminary development costs, while establishing clear precedents for community control of mineral rights. Other development companies had learned to approach the Trust Council with proposals that emphasized community benefit rather than corporate profit, and several successful partnerships had emerged from this collaborative approach. Mary Elizabeth's speech preparation was interrupted by a knock at the church door. Ruth opened it to find Thomas Bradley, the lawyer who had first delivered news of Mary's inheritance, carrying a familiar-looking document box. "Ruth, Mary Elizabeth, I hope you have a few minutes," Thomas said with the same gentle formality he had shown on that life-changing day 5 years earlier. "I've discovered something in Pastor William's papers that I think you should see." They gathered around the table in what had been Pastor William's office, now a comfortable meeting space with photographs documenting 5 years of community achievements covering the walls. Thomas opened the document box to reveal a sealed envelope, addressed to Mary Elizabeth McKinney, to be opened on her 11th birthday. Mary Elizabeth accepted the envelope with the careful attention she brought to all matters concerning her grandfather's legacy. Inside was a letter written in Pastor William's familiar handwriting, dated just days before his death. "My dearest Mary Elizabeth," she read aloud, "if you are reading this letter, then you have successfully guided our community through the challenges of discovering and managing the treasure that God placed beneath our land. I knew when I left the church that you possessed the wisdom and courage necessary to ensure that these resources would benefit everyone, not just yourself." The letter continued with Pastor William's reflections on community stewardship and the importance of democratic participation in decisions that affect people's lives. But the final paragraph contained a revelation that brought tears to Ruth's eyes. "Mary Elizabeth, there is one more gift that I have saved for this moment. In the church basement behind the furnace, you will find a collection of letters from families throughout our region who have heard about our community's success and want to learn how they can establish similar democratic land trusts in their own communities. These letters represent the most important legacy of our work together, the knowledge that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they work together with faith, courage, and commitment to the common good." Mary Elizabeth looked up from the letter with an expression that mixed excitement with understanding of the responsibility that came with her grandfather's final gift. "Miss Ruth, I think Grandpa William is asking us to help other communities learn what we've learned." Ruth nodded, feeling the familiar sense of stepping into an unknown future that had characterized every important decision they had made together over the past 5 years. That evening, as the sun set over the restored church and the prosperous community that surrounded it, Ruth and Mary Elizabeth walked through the cemetery where Pastor William was buried beneath a simple stone that read, "He believed in the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things." Mary Elizabeth knelt by her grandfather's grave and spoke with the same matter-of-fact clarity that had impressed everyone who knew her. "Grandpa William, we kept your treasure safe, and we shared it like you wanted us to. Now we're going to help other people learn how to do the same thing." Ruth stood beside this remarkable young woman who had inherited not just property and mineral rights, but a vision of community democracy that was spreading to rural areas throughout the country. Sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting for the right hearts to discover them and the right hands to share them with the world. As they walked back toward the church, Mary Elizabeth asked the question that would guide their next chapter. "Miss Ruth, how many communities do you think we can help?"